The radio crackled to life in the frozen trench somewhere along the Eastern Front in December 1943. Lieutenant Viktor Petrov pressed the receiver against his ear, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter cold. The message was brief, almost absurd in its timing. Operation Vanguard, the mission he'd been preparing for over the past 72 hours, had been called off. High Command had reassessed the strategic value of the target. The assault was no longer necessary. But there was a problem, a significant one that headquarters didn't yet know about. Viktor had already completed his preliminary objective. 21 German snipers, positioned in the ruins of what used to be a small industrial town, were already dead by his hand. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more incredible tales from history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more content like this. The winter of 1943 was particularly brutal along the Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad had concluded earlier that year with a Soviet victory, but the war was far from over. The front lines had stabilized in some areas while remaining fluid and dangerous in others. Viktor Petrov, a 28-year-old former hunter from Siberia, had been recruited into the Red Army's Sniper Division 18 months earlier. His skills with a rifle were exceptional, honed during years of tracking wolves and bears through the taiga. But nothing in his previous life had prepared him for what he would face in this war. The mission briefing had come 3 days prior, delivered by a stern-faced major with frost clinging to his moustache. A German forward observation post had been established in the ruins of a town called Krasny Bereg, approximately 8 kilometers behind enemy lines. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were using the position to coordinate artillery strikes against Soviet supply lines. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. A small assault team would infiltrate the area, neutralize the observation post, and extract before German reinforcements could respond. Viktor's role was equally straightforward. As the team's designated marksman, he would infiltrate ahead of the main group, identify and eliminate enemy snipers who could threaten the assault team during their approach and extraction. Viktor had moved into position under cover of darkness 2 nights before the scheduled assault. He traveled alone, carrying only his Mosin Nagant rifle with a PE scope, 400 rounds of ammunition, a white camouflage suit, dried meat, and a water canteen that he kept close to his body to prevent freezing. The temperature hovered around -25 degrees Celsius, cold enough to make metal burn bare skin and turn spit to ice before it hit the ground. He moved slowly, deliberately, taking nearly 6 hours to cover the 8 kilometers to his observation position. Speed meant noise, and noise meant death. His hide was a partially collapsed basement in what remained of a residential building on the outskirts of Krasny Bereg. The structure had taken a direct hit from artillery, leaving the upper floors completely destroyed, but the basement walls remained largely intact. Rubble and debris provided natural concealment, and a gap in the collapsed ceiling offered a limited but serviceable field of view toward the German positions. Viktor settled in, packed snow around his position to insulate against the cold, and began the methodical process of surveying the enemy positions through his scope. The first German sniper revealed himself on the morning of the second day. Viktor had been scanning the ruins systematically, grid by grid, looking for the telltale signs of a concealed position. A slight shadow inconsistency in a third-floor window, a pattern of rubble that looked too deliberate, the absence of snow on a surface that should have accumulated it overnight. The German was good, well-trained and disciplined. His hide was in the remains of what appeared to be a school building, positioned behind a collapsed section of wall that provided both cover and a clear line of sight toward the Soviet lines. But he had made one mistake, a small one, but fatal nonetheless. The morning sun, low on the horizon, caught the edge of his scope lens for just a fraction of a second. Viktor waited. Patience was perhaps the most important quality in a sniper. more important even than marksmanship. He watched the position for another 40 minutes, noting the angle of the rifle barrel, the slight movements that indicated breathing, the timing of when the German scanned different sectors. Then when the enemy sniper adjusted his position to scan westward, away from Victor's location, he took the shot. The Mosin Nagant bucked against his shoulder with a familiar recoil. The German slumped forward, visible for just a moment, before gravity pulled him back into the shadows of his hide. One down. Victor didn't allow himself any sense of satisfaction. This was work, necessary and methodical. He shifted his position within his hide, moving 3 meters to a secondary firing point he'd prepared. A basic principle of sniper warfare: never take a second shot from the same location. Even if the enemy hadn't spotted your muzzle flash or heard the report, they would be triangulating on your general area. Staying mobile, even within the confines of a small hide, was essential to survival. The second and third German snipers were positioned in mutual support, able to cover each other's sectors and watch for threats to their partner. Victor identified them on the afternoon of the second day. They were in adjacent buildings, separated by perhaps 30 meters, positioned at different elevations to maximize their overlapping fields of fire. It was smart deployment, the kind of tactical thinking that indicated these weren't novices, but experienced soldiers who understood their craft. Taking them out would require careful timing and a willingness to take risks. Victor waited until dusk, when the fading light would make it harder for other German observers to spot his muzzle flash. He took the higher-positioned sniper first, a shot of approximately 400 meters through a gap in a collapsed wall. The rifle's report echoed across the frozen ruins, loud in the winter stillness. He immediately shifted positions, moving to his third prepared firing point, and waited. The second German sniper, hearing the shot and realizing his partner was down, made the fatal mistake of breaking from his hide to assess the situation. Victor caught him moving across a window frame, silhouetted against the lighter interior of the building. The second shot was easier, a clean hit at 350 meters, 3 down. The pattern continued over the next day and a half, but each engagement presented its own unique challenges. The fourth sniper Victor identified was perhaps the most dangerous he'd encountered. The German had positioned himself in what appeared to be a water tower that had somehow survived the bombardment that destroyed most of the town. The elevation gave him an incredible advantage, allowing him to observe nearly the entire Soviet approach route. Victor spent 3 hours studying the position, watching for any pattern or weakness he could exploit. The German was methodical, scanning his sectors with military precision. Every 15 minutes he would complete a full sweep of his field of view, spending approximately 30 seconds observing each grid before moving to the next. Victor timed these sweeps across multiple cycles, noting that the sniper was most focused on the western and southern approaches, the most likely routes for a Soviet assault. The eastern sector, where Victor was positioned, received less attention, perhaps 10 seconds compared to 30, for the priority zones. Victor used that 10-second window. When the German scope turned toward his sector, Victor had already acquired the target, had already controlled his breathing, had already begun the smooth trigger pull that would send the round downrange. The shot was at extreme range for the Mosin Nagant, nearly 550 meters at a steep upward angle. Wind conditions were tricky, a crosswind from the northwest that required significant compensation. Victor aimed 2 meters to the right of the target and 1 meter high, trusting his experience and instincts. The rifle fired. Through his scope, Victor watched the German sniper jerk backward, then tumble from the tower. The body fell through the frozen air, landing in the snow below with a distant thud that Victor couldn't hear but could imagine. 4 down. But the shot had been loud, the report echoing across the ruins, and Victor knew other German snipers would be alert now, scanning for the shooter. He remained motionless in his hide for the next 2 hours, not even shifting position. Movement attracted attention, and right now every German sniper in the area would be searching for whoever had taken that shot. Victor used the time to rest, to eat a small portion of his dried meat, to wiggle his toes inside his boots to maintain circulation. The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and he could feel the cold seeping deeper into his core despite his layered clothing. The 5th and 6th snipers made a mistake that cost them both their lives. They broke cover to investigate the body of their fallen comrade from the water tower. Victor spotted them, moving through the ruins, advancing in bounds with one covering while the other moved. It was textbook infantry tactics, but the ruins didn't provide the cover they thought it did. From Victor's elevated position in the basement hide, he could see the gaps in the rubble. The spaces where their covering positions left them exposed for fractions of a second. He took the first one during a movement between cover positions, a snapshot at 280 meters as the German crossed an open courtyard. The second sniper, hearing his partner fall, made the fatal error of looking toward the sound rather than seeking cover. Victor's second shot caught him while he was still processing what had happened, still trying to locate the threat. 6 down. But Victor was now seriously concerned about ammunition. He'd fired 8 rounds so far, more than he'd anticipated, and he still had at least 15 more enemy snipers to eliminate based on his reconnaissance. The 7th sniper was killed purely by accident, or perhaps by fate. Victor was scanning a section of ruins he'd already cleared, double-checking his earlier assessment, when he noticed something unusual. A piece of canvas, white like snow camouflage, shifted slightly in the wind, but the wind wasn't blowing. Victor focused his scope on the area, watching intently. After 5 minutes, the canvas moved again, just slightly, the kind of movement made by someone adjusting their position. The German had been there all along, so well concealed that Victor had missed him on his initial sweep. This sniper had chosen a ground-level hide, burrowed into a pile of rubble with only a small opening for his rifle barrel and scope. It was excellent concealment, nearly perfect, but it also limited his field of view and made movement difficult. Victor studied the position for another 10 minutes, identifying the exact location of the rifle barrel based on the angle of the canvas and the shadow patterns. Then he fired 3 rounds in rapid succession, all aimed at the approximate center of the hide. He couldn't see the German, couldn't confirm the kill visually, but the canvas stopped moving and no return fire came. 7 down, and his ammunition situation was becoming critical. He was down to less than 300 rounds now, and he still needed to complete his mission and have enough left for the extraction. The 8th through 12th snipers were eliminated over the course of the next 6 hours as darkness fell on the second day. Night operations were different, more about patience and waiting for mistakes than active hunting. German soldiers, like all soldiers, became less disciplined at night. They moved more, talked more, assumed the darkness provided more protection than it actually did. Victor used a Soviet innovation called the PEM scope attachment, a primitive night vision device that amplified available light. It was crude compared to what would come later in the war, heavy and limited in range, but it gave him an advantage in the darkness. The 8th sniper revealed himself by lighting a cigarette. The tiny flare of the match was visible even at 400 meters, a brief but fatal error. Victor didn't take the shot immediately. Instead, he waited until the German had finished his cigarette and returned to his position, assuming the moment of vulnerability had passed. Then Victor fired, catching the sniper as he settled back into his hide. 8 down. The 9th and 10th were killed within minutes of each other, both stationed in what appeared to be a German command post in the center of town. Victor had been avoiding that area, assuming it would be too heavily defended, too risky to engage. But as he watched through his scope, he realized the Germans had made a tactical error. They'd positioned 2 snipers on the roof of the building, probably to provide overwatch for the command staff below. But they'd positioned them too close together, within 5 meters of each other. When Victor took the first shot, eliminating the nearest sniper, the second one panicked. Instead of taking cover or returning fire, he stood up, trying to see where the shot had come from. Victor's second round caught him center mass, 9 and 10 down. The 11th sniper almost killed Victor. The German had positioned himself in a mirror hide, a location almost identical to Victor's own position, using the same tactical advantages of elevation and concealment. When Victor was scanning a sector to the north, his scope briefly passed across a reflection, a tiny glint of light that shouldn't have been there. He froze, not moving his rifle, not adjusting his position. His mind raced through the possibilities. What had caused that reflection? A scope lens catching ambient light, a piece of metal from destroyed equipment, or another sniper watching his position? Victor remained motionless for 20 minutes, barely breathing, his eyes still pressed to his scope. Then he saw it again, the briefest flash as the German sniper adjusted his position. They were watching each other, both aware the other was there, both waiting for the other to make a mistake. It became a test of will and patience, a duel conducted in complete silence across 300 meters of frozen ruins. The German broke first. Perhaps he was cold, or perhaps he simply lost the battle of nerves. He shifted his position slightly, creating a larger opening in his hide. Victor saw the movement and fired immediately, not at where the German was, but at where he would be if he was completing the movement. The timing was perfect. The German moved directly into the path of Victor's bullet. 11 down, but Victor's hands were shaking slightly as he reloaded, the adrenaline of the close call finally hitting him. The 12th sniper was positioned in a church bell tower, one of the few structures that remained largely intact. The German had taken advantage of the height and the narrow window openings, creating a position that was nearly impossible to approach from ground level. But the bell tower had a weakness. The windows were Gothic arches, narrow at the bottom and wider at the top, designed for aesthetics rather than military defense. Victor waited until morning light, until the sun was positioned directly behind his own position, flooding the church with harsh eastern light. The glare forced the German sniper to adjust his position, moving to the shadowed side of the bell tower to avoid the sun in his eyes. That movement, that brief moment of silhouette against the lighter interior, was enough. 12 down. By the third day, Victor's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, but dangerous. His fingers were sluggish, requiring conscious effort to move. His feet had lost most sensation below the ankles. His water was gone, and he'd resorted to eating snow, which only made the hypothermia worse, but was necessary to prevent dehydration. His dried meat was nearly exhausted, and hunger was becoming a constant companion. But the mission continued. The 13th and 14th snipers were positioned in what appeared to be a factory complex on the northern edge of town. They'd established interlocking fields of fire, covering each other's approaches and blind spots. Victor studied their positions for hours, looking for a weakness, some pattern he could exploit. Finally, he noticed that every 40 minutes, one of the snipers would briefly leave his position, presumably to report to a commander or to relieve himself. During those 5 minutes, the remaining sniper had to cover both sectors, dividing his attention. Victor waited for the next rotation, timing it precisely. When one German left his position, Victor immediately engaged the remaining sniper, firing 2 rounds in quick succession. The first round missed, impacting the wall just above the target. The second found its mark. Then Victor shifted aim to the approach route where the other sniper would return, placing his crosshairs on the doorway. 30 seconds later, the German appeared, moving quickly after hearing the shots. Victor's third round caught him in the doorway. 13 and 14 down. The 15th sniper was the youngest Victor had seen, probably no more than 19 or 20 years old. Victor watched him through his scope for nearly an hour before taking the shot, noting the nervous movements, the frequent position adjustments, the lack of discipline that marked an inexperienced soldier. The boy was scared, alone in the ruins, probably wondering what he was doing in this frozen hell so far from home. Victor felt a moment of hesitation, a rare emotional response to his work. But the mission required it. This young German, inexperienced as he was, still had a rifle pointed towards Soviet lines, still represented a threat to the assault team that was supposed to infiltrate tomorrow night. Victor took the shot, clean and quick. 15 down. The 16th through 20th snipers were eliminated over the course of 6 hours on the afternoon of the third day. Victor was running on instinct now, his body pushed beyond normal limits by cold and exhaustion. Each shot required tremendous concentration, fighting through the shaking hands and blurred vision that came with advanced hypothermia. But his training held. Each engagement was methodical, patient, precise. The 16th was in a basement position similar to Victor's own. The 17th and 18th were in a 2-story building that had been converted into a defensive position. The 19th was positioned on a railway embankment with excellent fields of fire, but poor concealment. The 20th was in a drainage culvert, using the concrete pipe as a natural hide. Victor killed them all, each shot placed exactly where it needed to be, each engagement planned and executed with the same cold precision that had characterized the entire operation. His ammunition was critically low now, less than 50 rounds remaining. But he had one more target, one final enemy sniper that he'd identified but hadn't been able to engage. The 21st sniper was the best Victor had encountered. The German was older, probably in his mid-30s, with the confidence and patience that came from years of experience. His position was in a partially collapsed apartment building, carefully chosen to provide multiple firing positions and escape routes. He moved between locations within his hide, never staying in one spot long enough for an observer to track him. He used a periscope to scan sectors without exposing his scope lens to counter sniper fire. He was, in short, a professional who understood his craft. Victor spent the last hours of daylight studying this final target, learning his patterns, identifying his weaknesses. Everyone had weaknesses, even the best. For this German, the weakness was confidence. He'd been in this position for days, maybe weeks, without being engaged. He'd become comfortable, perhaps even complacent. And that comfort manifested in small ways. A slightly longer pause when scanning certain sectors, a predictable pattern of movement between firing positions, a reliance on the periscope that created brief moments when his own scope wasn't trained on potential threats. As evening approached on the third day, Victor made his move. He fired a single round at a building far to the north, deliberately missing any target but creating a loud report that would attract attention. The German sniper immediately shifted to his northern firing position, moving to investigate the sound. For 15 seconds, his attention was completely focused away from Victor's sector. Victor had already acquired the target, had already compensated for wind and distance, had already begun his trigger pull. The shot was at maximum range for his rifle and conditions, nearly 600 meters in failing light with a crosswind. But Victor trusted his training, trusted his instincts, trusted the countless hours he'd spent mastering his weapon. The rifle fired. The German sniper collapsed, visible for just a moment before falling back into the shadows of his position. 21 down. His ammunition reserves were running low, down to less than 100 rounds. His water was nearly gone, and despite his efforts to stay warm, the cold was beginning to affect his fingers and toes. He could still feel them, which was good, but the sensation was distant, dulled by the extended exposure. He needed to extract soon, regardless of when the assault team arrived. Another 12 hours in these conditions, and he'd be risking serious frostbite. That's when the radio message came through. Victor stared at the receiver for a long moment after the transmission ended, processing the implications. The mission was cancelled. High Command had determined that the German observation post was no longer a priority target. Recent advances on other sectors of the front had rendered the artillery coordination in this area less critical. The assault team that was supposed to insert tonight would not be coming. He was to extract immediately and return to friendly lines. Under normal circumstances, this would have been welcome news. A cancelled mission meant he could leave his frozen hide, make his way back across the 8 kilometers of no man's land, and return to something resembling warmth and safety. But these weren't normal circumstances. He'd killed 21 German snipers over the past 3 days. 21 soldiers who would no longer be reporting to their commanders, who wouldn't be rotating back to their units, who had simply disappeared during what was supposed to be a routine deployment. The Germans weren't stupid. They would notice. They would investigate. And when they did, they would realize that someone had systematically eliminated nearly every sniper in this sector. The implications were significant. If the assault team had proceeded as planned, the deaths of the snipers would have been explained by the attack. They would have been casualties of a larger operation, tragic but understandable losses in the context of combat. But without the assault, without any apparent reason for their deaths, the Germans would know something else was happening. They would increase security, change their patterns, perhaps even suspect that Soviet forces had penetrated deeper into their lines than previously believed. Worst of all, they might retaliate, not against military targets, but against the civilian population of the surrounding area, suspected of harboring or assisting enemy infiltrators. Victor considered his options. He could follow orders, extract immediately, and let headquarters deal with the consequences. That was the safest course of action, the one that kept him alive and followed military protocol. But he'd spent 2 years on the Eastern Front. He'd seen what happened when Germans suspected partisan activity in an area. Summary executions, burned villages, populations displaced into the winter cold with nothing but the clothes on their backs. If his actions here triggered that kind of response, innocent people would die because of him. The alternative was to stay, to create a narrative that the Germans could understand and accept. If more Soviet soldiers appeared in the area, if there was evidence of a broader military operation rather than a single infiltrator, the German command might interpret the sniper deaths as part of a larger engagement rather than a targeted operation. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it might prevent civilian casualties. Victor reached for his secondary objective pack, the one containing signal flares and documents he was supposed to use to guide the assault team to the target. He'd been instructed to destroy these materials if the mission was cancelled, but instead, he began planning how to use them to stage a false military presence. If he could make it look like a small Soviet recon unit had been operating in the area, had engaged German forces and then withdrawn, it might be enough. The Germans would investigate, find evidence of military activity, and conclude that the sniper deaths were combat casualties rather than something more sinister. He waited until full dark, then left his hide for the first time in 3 days. Moving through the ruins was treacherous. Every step had to be tested, every sound evaluated. German patrols would be more active now, searching for whoever had been killing their snipers. Victor moved in a wide arc around the town, placing signal markers in positions that suggested a recon team had been observing German positions from multiple angles. He left empty ration tins, cigarette butts, even a damaged Soviet helmet he'd found in an abandoned position. Small things, but enough to create a narrative. The hardest part was setting off the flares. It would draw attention, possibly immediate and violent attention. but it was necessary to sell the illusion of a departed military unit, one that had been active in the area and had now withdrawn. Victor positioned himself in a drainage ditch on the eastern edge of the ruins, giving himself a clear escape route towards Soviet lines. Then he fired 3 red flares into the sky, the standard Soviet signal for mission complete and initiating extraction. The response was immediate. German voices called out in the darkness, orders being shouted, the sound of vehicles starting, the mechanical clatter of weapons being readied. Searchlights swept across the ruins, powerful beams cutting through the winter darkness. Victor stayed low in the drainage ditch, covered by his white camouflage, watching as German soldiers deployed to search the area. They were focused on the location where the flares had been launched, exactly as he'd hoped. While they searched the ruins, he began his crawl eastward, moving inch by inch through the frozen drainage ditch. The journey back to Soviet lines took 7 hours, but every minute felt like an eternity. Victor moved slowly, stopping frequently to listen, to watch, to ensure he wasn't being followed or about to crawl into a German patrol. The cold was worse now, the extended exposure beginning to take its toll. His fingers were completely numb, his toes barely responsive. Several times he had to stop and force himself to flex his extremities to maintain circulation, even though every movement sent daggers of pain through his limbs. Frostbite was setting in, he knew that. But he couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying, either from the cold or from German patrols that were undoubtedly searching for infiltrators. The drainage ditch provided some concealment, but it was also a natural route that German patrols would check. Victor had to make a calculated decision about a kilometer from the Soviet lines. Stay in the ditch and risk running into a patrol, or move overland where he would be more visible but less predictable. He chose overland, crawling through the snow-covered fields, using every slight depression and shadow for concealment. Twice he heard German patrols passing nearby, soldiers calling out to each other in the darkness, their voices carrying clearly in the frozen air. Once a patrol passed within 30 meters of his position, Victor lay completely still, buried in snow, his white camouflage making him nearly invisible against the winter landscape. He could hear their boots crunching in the snow, could hear fragments of their conversation. Complaints about the cold and the late hour. They passed without noticing him, continuing their patrol pattern toward the south. The worst moment came when Victor had to cross an open field, approximately 200 meters of completely exposed terrain, with no cover whatsoever. The field was illuminated by moonlight reflecting off the snow, making it nearly as bright as day. German observation posts on the high ground to the west would be able to see anyone crossing, but there was no alternative route. The field had to be crossed. Victor waited for cloud cover, watching the sky for nearly an hour until a bank of clouds drifted across the moon. In the temporary darkness, he began his crossing, moving in a slow crawl that minimized his silhouette. Halfway across, the clouds parted. Moonlight flooded the field, and Victor froze in place, knowing he was completely exposed. He heard a shout from the German lines, then another. Rifle fire cracked across the field, bullets kicking up snow around him. Victor abandoned stealth and ran. His frozen legs protested, cramping immediately, but adrenaline drove him forward. More rifle fire, the distinctive crack of Kar 98K rifles, bullets whipping past his head. He zigzagged, presenting a harder target, his lungs burning from the cold air and exertion. The Soviet lines were ahead, maybe 100 meters, but that 100 meters seemed impossible to cover. Machine gun fire opened up from the German positions, tracers arcing across the field like deadly fireflies. Victor threw himself into a shell crater, taking momentary cover as bullets passed overhead. He could hear Russian voices calling out from the Soviet trenches, probably telling him to stay down, that they would provide covering fire. But Victor knew he couldn't stay here. The Germans would adjust their fire, would drop mortar rounds on his position, would send out a patrol to capture or kill him. He gathered himself and ran again, sprinting the final distance toward the Soviet lines. His legs felt like they were moving through water, slow and unresponsive, but he drove himself forward. More rifle fire from behind, the angry buzz of bullets passing close. Then he was at the Soviet trench line, falling more than jumping into the muddy depression, landing hard on frozen earth. Soviet soldiers grabbed him, pulled him deeper into the trench as German fire continued to rake the position. Someone was shouting questions, demanding identification, weapons leveled at him until he could gasp out the current password. Recognition finally came, along with relief from the soldiers around him. They'd thought he was a German infiltrator until they heard him speak Russian, until they saw his uniform beneath the white camouflage. He crossed into Soviet-controlled territory just before dawn, identified by a forward observation post that nearly shot him before recognizing his uniform and code phrase. The soldiers at the post were young, conscripts who looked barely old enough to shave, and they stared at him with a mixture of awe and fear. He looked, he imagined, like something dragged from a frozen grave. His face was covered in frost, his uniform stiff with ice, his movements slow and mechanical. They brought him to a field hospital, a collection of tents 2 kilometers behind the lines. A doctor, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and efficient hands, examined him without comment. 2nd-degree frostbite on 6 fingers and 4 toes. Mild hypothermia. Dehydration. Exhaustion. She worked on him for an hour, warming his extremities gradually, administering fluids, wrapping him in blankets. She didn't ask about his mission. On the Eastern Front, everyone had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. The warming process was excruciating. As circulation returned to his frozen extremities, the pain intensified beyond anything Victor had experienced. His fingers and toes felt like they were being burned with hot irons, the nerve endings screaming as blood flow resumed. He bit down on a leather strap the doctor provided, refusing to cry out, refusing to show weakness, even though every instinct told him to scream. The pain lasted for hours, gradually subsiding to a constant throbbing ache that would persist for days. Other wounded soldiers in the hospital tent watched him with curiosity. His uniform, what remained visible under the blankets, marked him as a sniper. The white camouflage suit, the rifle that had been carefully set aside, the scope case that never left his side. They whispered among themselves, speculating about what mission could have left him in such condition. Some probably guessed he'd been behind enemy lines. Others likely assumed he'd been caught in an artillery barrage or survived a patrol gone wrong. None of them knew the truth, and Victor offered no explanation. He spent 36 hours in the field hospital, drifting in and out of fevered sleep. When he was awake, he found himself replaying the mission in his mind, analyzing each shot, each decision, looking for mistakes or better alternatives. The 21 German snipers appeared in his thoughts, not as enemies, but as fellow practitioners of the same craft. He wondered about their lives, their families, what had brought them to that frozen town where they died. It was unprofessional to think such thoughts, counterproductive to humanize the enemy, but Victor couldn't help himself. Perhaps it was the fever, or perhaps it was simply the accumulated weight of too many kills, too many lives ended by his hand. On the 2nd day, a medical sergeant came to check his wounds. The frostbite was responding to treatment, though he would likely lose 2 toenails and have permanent scarring on 3 fingers. The hypothermia had passed, his core temperature back to normal. The exhaustion would take longer to resolve, but he was young and strong. He would recover. The sergeant asked if he felt well enough to be debriefed. Victor nodded, knowing there was no point in delaying the inevitable. The debriefing came 2 days later, after he'd recovered enough to walk without assistance. A colonel from Division Intelligence arrived at the field hospital, a man with grey hair and calculating eyes. Victor told him everything: the 21 snipers, the cancelled mission, his decision to stage evidence of a larger operation. He expected reprimand, possibly worse. He'd disobeyed orders by not extracting immediately. He'd taken it upon himself to conduct an additional operation without authorization. He'd risked capture or death for a gamble that might not even have worked. The colonel listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Victor finished, there was a long silence. The only sound was the distant rumble of artillery, a constant background noise on the Eastern Front. Finally, the colonel pulled out a folder, extracted several sheets of paper covered in typed text. These were intercepted German radio transmissions, translated by Soviet intelligence. Victor scanned them quickly, his pulse quickening as he read. The Germans had indeed investigated the area, had found the evidence Victor left, and had concluded that a Soviet reconnaissance unit had penetrated their lines, conducted surveillance of their positions, and successfully withdrawn after completing their mission. They'd increased security in the sector, had reorganized their defensive positions, but had not taken any action against civilian populations. The transmissions made no mention of reprisals, no orders for investigations into partisan activity, no directives to interrogate local villagers. The colonel's assessment was frank and pragmatic. Victor's unauthorized actions had prevented what likely would have been brutal reprisals against local villages. From a strategic perspective, the operation was a success, even if it hadn't followed protocol. But there was more. The colonel spread additional documents on the table between them. German casualties in the sector over those 3 days. 21 snipers eliminated, plus an additional 3 soldiers killed during Victor's extraction when Soviet positions had provided covering fire. The German command was concerned, the reports showed. They'd lost nearly an entire sniper company in 72 hours. They were pulling back their forward observation posts, consolidating their positions, becoming more defensive. This tactical shift would benefit Soviet operations in adjacent sectors, would make planned offensives easier to execute, would save Russian lives. The colonel looked at Victor with those calculating eyes. There would be no official commendation, no medals, no public recognition. The mission had been unauthorized in its final phase, and documenting it officially would raise uncomfortable questions about command and control. But unofficially, the colonel wanted Victor to know that he had performed exceptionally, not just in his marksmanship, though that was impressive, but in his strategic thinking. He'd seen beyond the immediate mission parameters, had understood the broader implications of his actions, had made decisions that considered civilian safety and tactical impact. Those were the qualities of an officer, not just a soldier. Within a week, orders came through for Victor's transfer. He was being reassigned to a specialized sniper training unit at a facility 200 kilometers behind the front lines. His combat duties were over, at least temporarily. He would spend the next phase of the war teaching others what he had learned, passing on the skills and judgment that had kept him alive and made him effective. For a soldier, it was a good assignment, relatively safe, with regular food and heated barracks. But Victor found himself oddly reluctant to leave. The front had become familiar in a terrible way. He understood its rhythms, its dangers, its logic. Moving to a training facility felt like abandonment, like he was leaving his comrades behind while he took a comfortable position in the rear. Victor spent the next 18 months training new snipers, teaching them the technical skills of marksmanship, but also the harder lessons about patience, observation, and decision-making under pressure. He taught them how to read terrain, how to anticipate enemy movement, how to remain concealed for days in hostile territory. But more than that, he tried to teach them something harder to quantify: the responsibility that came with their skills, The weight of every shot taken, the consequences that rippled out from their actions. Not every student understood. Some saw sniping as simply another military skill, a specialized form of combat. But a few, a dedicated few, grasped what he was trying to convey. The training facility was located in a forest area, far enough from the front that artillery fire was only a distant rumble, but close enough that students understood the reality of what they were preparing for. Victor developed a comprehensive curriculum that combined technical instruction with practical exercises. Students spent hours on the range, learning proper breathing techniques, trigger control, ballistics calculations. But they also spent days in the forest, learning fieldcraft, camouflage, how to move without sound, how to remain motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions. Victor had a particular teaching method that some instructors criticized, but which proved effective. He would take students into the field and have them try to locate him after he'd concealed himself nearby. Most couldn't find him even when he was within 20 meters. Then he would reveal himself, walk them through his hide construction, explain the principles of shadow, background, shape, and movement. He taught them that being invisible wasn't about having perfect camouflage, but about understanding how human perception worked, about positioning yourself where eyes wouldn't naturally look. He also taught them about the mental aspect of sniping, the psychological toll of the work. In group discussions, he encouraged students to talk about their feelings regarding killing, about the difference between combat in close quarters and taking a life from distance through a scope. Some instructors thought this was unnecessary, even counterproductive. Soldiers needed to be hard, they argued, not introspective about the nature of their work. But Victor believed otherwise. Soldiers who didn't process these experiences became either reckless or broken. The best snipers, the ones who survived and remained effective, were those who understood what they were doing and had made peace with it. One student in particular stood out. Dmitry Sokolov, a 19-year-old from Moscow who had shown exceptional aptitude for marksmanship. The boy was technically perfect, could place shots with incredible precision, had excellent fieldcraft instincts. But Victor noticed something troubling. Dmitry talked about kills with enthusiasm, even excitement. He collected stories from other students about their combat experiences, seemed almost eager to get to the front and start his real work. Victor took Dmitry aside one evening after training. They walked through the forest as the sun set, talking about the boy's background, his family, his reasons for volunteering for sniper training. Dmitry explained that his father and two brothers had been killed in the early months of the war. He wanted revenge, wanted to make the Germans pay for what they'd taken from him. It was an understandable motivation, Victor acknowledged. But he needed Dmitry to understand something crucial. Sniping wasn't about revenge. It couldn't be, because revenge would make you reckless, would make you take shots you shouldn't, would get you killed. Victor shared something he rarely discussed. He told Dmitry about Krasny Bereg, about the 21 snipers, about the mission that was cancelled too late. But he focused on one particular detail, the 15th sniper, the young German who had been scared and inexperienced. Victor described watching that boy through his scope, seeing the fear in his movements, understanding that this was someone's son, someone's brother, probably someone who had been conscripted and didn't want to be in that frozen ruin any more than Victor wanted to be there. And then Victor had killed him anyway, because the mission required it, because that scared German boy with a rifle was still a threat. The point, Victor explained, wasn't that Dmitry should feel guilty about killing enemy soldiers. The war was real, the threat was real, and sometimes killing was necessary. But he needed to understand that the men he would kill through his scope were human beings, not abstract enemies or targets for revenge. That understanding would keep him sharp, would keep him making rational decisions rather than emotional ones, would keep him alive. Dmitri listened quietly, and Victor could see the enthusiasm dim somewhat in his eyes. It wasn't disappointment exactly, but a kind of sobering realization. Good, Victor thought. The boy was learning. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. Victor had survived 4 years of combat, had trained over 200 snipers, many of whom had gone on to distinguish themselves in battle. When demobilization began, he was offered a position in the Soviet military, a training role that would have provided security and prestige. He declined. The years of war had taken something from him, some essential part that he needed to recover away from military structure and discipline. He returned to Siberia, to the forests and mountains where he'd grown up. He built a small cabin on the edge of the taiga, far from towns and cities, and returned to hunting. But it was different now. The forests that had once felt like home seemed strange to him, too quiet, too peaceful. He would find himself scanning the tree line for threats that weren't there, listening for sounds of approaching soldiers in the rustle of wind through branches. The war had ended, but its echoes continued in ways he couldn't entirely escape. The first few months were the hardest. Victor would wake in the night, convinced he heard German voices, that enemy patrols were approaching his position. He'd find himself reaching for his rifle, his heart pounding, before reality reasserted itself, and he remembered where he was. The nightmares came frequently, vivid dreams where he was back in Krasny Bereg, back in that frozen basement, but this time he couldn't make the shots, his rifle wouldn't fire, or the Germans kept coming no matter how many he killed. He tried to resume his old life, tracking animals through the forest, providing meat for nearby villages. But hunting had changed for him. When he tracked a deer or a wolf, when he lined up a shot through his scope, he would sometimes see not the animal, but one of those 21 German snipers. The 15th one particularly, the young scared boy who had died alone in the ruins. Victor would lower his rifle, unable to take the shot, and the animal would escape. It happened often enough that he began to worry about his ability to provide for himself through the winter. He tried other work. A logging company was operating in the area, and they hired him as a safety officer, someone to watch for dangerous wildlife while the crews worked. It was simple work, requiring his tracking skills but not his marksmanship. But even there the war followed him. The sound of falling trees reminded him of artillery. The diesel smell from the equipment brought back memories of burning vehicles. The radio chatter between crews sounded too much like military communications. After 3 months, he quit, unable to explain to the foreman exactly why he couldn't continue. Years passed. Victor married a woman from a nearby village, a schoolteacher named Anna, who asked few questions about his military service and seemed to understand his need for solitude. Their courtship was quiet, conducted during his occasional trips to the village for supplies. She'd noticed him in the general store, had struck up a conversation about a book she was reading. They'd talked about literature, about the forests, about everything except the war. On their third meeting, she'd asked him directly if he'd been a soldier. He'd said yes. She'd nodded and changed the subject, and he'd appreciated that more than he could express. They married in the spring of 1947 in a small ceremony attended by a handful of villagers. Anna moved into his cabin, bringing her books and her warmth into his isolated life. She taught him, slowly and patiently, how to exist in peacetime. When he woke from nightmares, she was there, not asking questions, but simply present. When he fell into dark moods, unable to explain the weight he felt, she gave him space without judgment. She became his anchor to the present, the thing that kept him from drifting too far into memories of the war. They had 2 children, both daughters, who grew up learning to move quietly through the forest and shoot accurately with a rifle. Victor taught them to hunt, to track, to respect the wilderness, but he never spoke about the war. His daughters knew their father had been a soldier, had fought on the Eastern Front, but the details remained unspoken. Anna had made clear to them, in her gentle but firm way, that some things were not to be asked about. The girls understood, in the way children understand things without needing words, that their father carried burdens they couldn't lift. Victor found some peace in those years. The nightmares became less frequent, the sudden starts at unexpected sounds less common. He learned to hunt again, to take necessary shots without seeing ghosts. The forest became familiar once more, a place of life rather than danger. But the war never truly left him. It was there in the scars on his fingers from frostbite, in the way he always positioned himself with his back to a wall, in his habit of checking sightlines and fields of fire, even in peaceful settings. Anna learned to recognize when he was having a difficult day, when the memories were particularly heavy. On those days, she would suggest he take a walk in the forest alone, understanding that he needed solitude to process whatever he was feeling. It was 1963, 20 years after the mission that was cancelled too late, when Victor received an unexpected visitor. A man in civilian clothes arrived at his cabin, carrying papers that identified him as working for the Soviet government. He was younger than Victor, probably in his mid-30s, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to gathering information. He explained that the government was conducting interviews with veterans, collecting oral histories for archival purposes. They were particularly interested in speaking with soldiers who had distinguished themselves in combat. Would Victor be willing to share his experiences? Victor's first instinct was to refuse. The past was the past, and dragging it back into the present seemed pointless and potentially painful. But the man was persistent in a polite, professional way. He explained that many veterans were aging now, their memories fading, their stories being lost. Future generations needed to understand what the war had been like, not just the grand strategies and major battles, but the individual experiences of soldiers who had fought. Victor remained skeptical, but eventually agreed to speak, though he insisted the conversation remain classified, not for public distribution. They sat in Victor's cabin over several days, drinking tea and speaking about the war. The interviewer had a way of asking questions that drew out details Victor hadn't thought about in years. Where had he grown up? What had his life been like before the war? How had he been recruited into the sniper division? The questions started broadly, establishing context, before narrowing to specific operations and experiences. Victor found, to his surprise, that talking about it was easier than he'd expected. 20 years of distance had dulled some of the sharper edges of memory, had allowed him to contextualize experiences that had seemed incomprehensible at the time. He spoke about his training, about learning to shoot under the guidance of experienced marksmen, about the transition from hunting animals to hunting men. He spoke about the cold, the constant companion on the Eastern Front, and how it affected everything from weapon maintenance to tactical decisions. He spoke about comrades he'd lost, good men who had died in ways both heroic and meaningless. Alexei, who had been killed by a random artillery shell while eating breakfast in what should have been a safe position. Mikhail, who had survived 2 years of combat only to step on a mine during what should have been a routine patrol. Yuri, who had been captured by Germans and whose fate remained unknown but could be imagined. The interviewer took notes carefully, asking follow-up questions that showed he was listening, that he understood the significance of what was being shared. On the third day, Victor spoke about Krasny Bereg, about the 21 snipers and the mission that was cancelled too late. He found himself going into more detail than he'd intended, describing each engagement, the specific challenges of individual targets, the deteriorating conditions in his hide. He talked about the cold in specific terms, the way it affected his fingers and made precision shooting difficult, the way hunger sharpened his focus but also made his hands shake. He described the mental calculation he'd had to make when the mission was cancelled, weighing the risks of different courses of action, trying to anticipate consequences he couldn't fully predict. The interviewer listened carefully, taking detailed notes. When Victor finished describing the events, the man was quiet for a moment. Then he mentioned something Victor hadn't known. After the war, when Soviet forces had fully occupied the sector, they'd found German military records from the area. The documents included an investigation report from December 1943 detailing the loss of 21 snipers over a 3-day period. The German command had concluded, based on the evidence they found, that a Soviet reconnaissance unit had infiltrated their lines, conducted surveillance, and withdrawn after completing their mission. There was no mention of reprisals against civilians, no documented executions or village burnings in the sector following the incident. Victor's improvised deception had worked exactly as he'd hoped. Victor felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying for 20 years. He'd wondered, in quiet moments over the decades, whether his decision that night had been the right one. He'd second-guessed himself, played out alternative scenarios in his mind, worried that perhaps he'd taken unnecessary risks, or that the Germans had seen through his deception and taken actions that he'd never learned about. But now, he knew. The civilians in that sector had been spared, and it had been because of what he'd done. The interviewer asked the obvious question: why had Victor risked his life to stage that evidence? He'd completed his mission, eliminated the enemy snipers. He could have simply extracted as ordered and let the consequences fall where they may. What had motivated him to take that additional risk? Victor considered the question for a long time before answering. He thought about trying to explain it in strategic terms, talking about tactical considerations and mission objectives. But that wasn't really the truth, or at least not the whole truth. The real answer was simpler and more complicated at the same time. He explained that war forced impossible choices on people, decisions that had to be made with incomplete information and under extreme pressure. You did what you thought was right in the moment, based on the information you had and the values you carried. Sometimes those decisions worked out, sometimes they didn't. But you had to be able to live with yourself afterward, had to be able to look at your own actions and feel they were justified, even if they defied orders or conventional wisdom. Victor talked about the villages he'd passed through during his years on the Eastern Front, the civilian populations caught between armies, suffering hardships that had nothing to do with military objectives or strategic goals. He'd seen what happened when suspicion fell on civilian populations, when military forces decided that everyone in an area was potentially an enemy. He'd seen summary executions, burned homes, families displaced in winter conditions that few would survive. He couldn't control most of that, couldn't prevent the terrible things that war did to innocent people. But in that specific moment, in Krasny Bereg, he'd had the ability to potentially prevent that kind of suffering. Not following through, not taking that risk, would have haunted him more than any of the Germans he'd killed. The interviewer nodded, writing that down. Then he asked another question. Looking back now, with 2 decades of distance, did Victor have any regrets about his actions that night? Did he wish he'd done anything differently? Victor thought about his daughters, growing up safe in a peaceful village. He thought about Anna, teaching children to read in a school that hadn't been burned by retreating armies. He thought about all the villages in that sector that had survived the war intact because German command had seen military action rather than civilian conspiracy. Then he answered simply, no, he had no regrets. Given the same circumstances and the same information, he would make the same choice again. But he added something else, something he hadn't consciously articulated before. He regretted the necessity of it all. He regretted that circumstances had forced him to kill 21 men, most of whom were probably as reluctant to be in that war as he was. He regretted that the world had produced a situation where his skills as a hunter had been turned to hunting humans, where his ability to place shots accurately had been used to end lives rather than provide food. He regretted the nightmares, the difficulty returning to normal life, the parts of himself that had been changed in ways that couldn't be undone, but he didn't regret his specific decisions, his actions. Those he could live with. The interview ended not long after that. The man thanked Victor for his time, packed his notes, and departed. Victor never heard from him again, never learned what became of that oral history. He assumed it was filed away in some government archive, one story among thousands, forgotten by everyone except those who had lived it. But the interview had an unexpected effect on Victor. For weeks after the man left, he found himself thinking more clearly about the war than he had in years. The process of articulating his experiences, of putting them into words for someone else to understand, had somehow organized them in his mind. The nightmares didn't stop completely, but they changed. They became less chaotic, less overwhelming. He could wake from them and understand what he was experiencing, could separate memory from present reality more easily. He began, slowly, to share more with Anna. Not everything, not the graphic details that would serve no purpose except to burden her with images she didn't need. But he talked about the broader experiences, the fear and exhaustion, the comradeship and loss, the moral complications of war. Anna listened without judgment, without trying to offer solutions or reassurance. She simply listened, and that was exactly what Victor needed. He also began talking with his daughters as they grew older. Not about specific combat experiences, but about the larger lessons he'd learned, about the importance of thinking through consequences before acting, about the responsibility that came with power or skill, about the necessity of making difficult choices and living with them. His daughters, now teenagers, understood that their father was sharing something important, even if they didn't fully grasp the context from which these lessons emerged. One of his daughters, Katya, the younger one, showed interest in joining the military. It was 1968, and the Soviet Union was actively recruiting young women for various military roles. Katya was intelligent, disciplined, athletic. She would make an excellent soldier, but when she told her father about her plans, Victor felt his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't expected. They talked for hours that night, sitting by the fire in the cabin. Victor asked her why she wanted to join, what she hoped to accomplish. Katya explained that she wanted to serve her country, to do something meaningful with her life, to prove herself in a challenging environment. They were good reasons, Victor acknowledged. But he needed her to understand something. The military would test her, would push her to her limits, would ask things of her that might change who she was. That wasn't necessarily bad, but it was important to go in with open eyes, understanding the costs as well as the benefits. He told her more directly than he ever had before about some of his experiences in the war. Not the graphic details, but the emotional reality. The weight of taking lives, the burden of command decisions that affected others. The difficulty of returning to normal life after experiencing extreme situations. He told her about students he'd trained who had died, about the responsibility he felt for their deaths, even though he'd given them the best preparation he could. He told her about the scars that remained, not physical but psychological, the ways the war had changed him that he was still discovering decades later. Katya listened carefully. Then she asked a question that surprised him. Given everything he'd been through, everything the war had cost him, did he think military service had been worthwhile? Would he make the same choice again? Victor thought about that. It was different from the interviewer's question about specific decisions. This was broader, more fundamental. He answered honestly, the war had been necessary. Someone had to stop the German advance. Someone had to fight for their country and their people. He didn't regret his service in that sense. But he wished deeply that the war hadn't been necessary at all. He wished human beings had found better ways to resolve their conflicts, that his generation hadn't been forced to kill or be killed. If Katya joined the military now, in peacetime, she would have a different experience than he'd had. But she should understand that military service fundamentally prepared people for war, and war was the worst thing human beings did to each other. Katya ultimately decided to pursue a different path, studying to become a teacher like her mother. Victor never knew if their conversation had influenced that decision or if she'd been considering other options all along. But he was quietly relieved, even though he would have supported her choice either way. Viktor Petrov died in 1979 at the age of 64, not from wounds or war-related injuries, but from simple old age. His heart, which had been strong enough to carry him through 4 years of war and decades of life afterward, simply stopped one morning while he was chopping wood outside his cabin. Anna found him there, fallen in the snow, the axe still gripped in his hand. The doctor who examined him said it had been quick, probably painless. Victor had lived 15 more years than many of his comrades, had seen his daughters grow into women, had found some measure of peace in his later years. His funeral was attended by his family, by neighbors from the village, by a few old comrades who made the journey to Siberia to pay their respects. Some of his former students came, now middle-aged men themselves, to honor the instructor who had taught them not just how to be snipers, but how to be thinking, responsible soldiers. They shared stories of their training, of lessons Victor had taught them, of his patience and skill. Some of them had gone on to become instructors themselves, passing on what Victor had taught them to a new generation. They buried him in a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the Taiga, with a simple marker that listed his name, dates, and service in the Red Army. There was no mention of missions or medals, no detailed account of his wartime service. Just a name and dates, one life among millions that had been shaped by that terrible conflict. At Anna's request, they added one line to the marker, a quote Victor had once shared with her. It read simply, "He did what he thought was right." But his story survived, passed down through his daughters to his grandchildren, preserved in that government interview that remained classified for decades. It became, in a small way, part of the larger historical record of the Eastern Front, one example among thousands of individual soldiers making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. Not a story of grand strategy or decisive battles, but of one man trying to do what he thought was right in a situation where all choices had consequences. The ruins of Krasny Bereg, where Victor spent those 3 frozen days, were eventually cleared and rebuilt. The town never regained its pre-war population, but it survived, a small collection of houses and shops where people lived ordinary lives. The rebuilding took years, starting in the late 1940s and continuing through the 50s. Families returned from evacuation, or new families moved in, attracted by government incentives for resettling formerly contested areas. The scars of war remained visible in the architecture, buildings that had been reconstructed rather than restored, gaps in the urban fabric where structures had been too damaged to salvage. Few residents knew about what had happened there during the winter of 1943, about the 21 German snipers or the Soviet marksmen who killed them. The war had touched every corner of the Eastern Front, and most communities had their own stories of survival and loss. Krasny Bereg was no different in that regard. The older residents, those who had lived through the occupation, remembered the German presence, the fear that had pervaded daily life, the relief when Soviet forces had finally driven the occupiers back. But the specific details of military operations, the individual engagements and tactical maneuvers, these remained largely unknown to the civilian population. There was one person who knew more than most. Vera Nikolaevna, a woman who had been a young girl during the war, had stayed in Krasny Bereg through the German occupation, hiding with her family in the cellar of their partially destroyed home. She remembered the German soldiers, remembered the snipers who had occupied various buildings in the town. She remembered particularly vividly 3 days in December 1943 when the snipers had become nervous, when officers had been rushing around giving orders, when there had been a palpable sense of fear among the occupying forces. Vera had been too young to understand what was happening at the time, but as she grew older, as she heard stories and pieced together fragments of history, she began to form a picture. Something had happened during those 3 days, something that had frightened the Germans enough that they'd changed their deployment patterns, had become more defensive, had ultimately pulled back from some of their forward positions. She'd heard older villagers whisper about a Soviet soldier, a ghost who had moved through the ruins killing Germans. But it had always been just a story, something that might have been true or might have been wishful thinking by people desperate for any sign of resistance against their occupiers. It wasn't until the 1980s, when she was in her 50s, that Vera learned more. The government had begun declassifying some military records from the war, making them available for historical research. Vera, who had become a local historian, documenting the town's experiences during the occupation, requested access to records related to Krasny Bereg. Among the documents she received was a report from December 1943, describing a reconnaissance operation in the area, the elimination of enemy snipers, and the successful extraction of the operative. The report was heavily redacted, with names and specific tactical details removed. But Vera could piece together enough to understand what had happened. A Soviet sniper had infiltrated the town, had systematically eliminated German snipers over a 3-day period, had staged evidence of a larger military presence to protect civilians from reprisals. It confirmed the whispered stories she'd heard as a child, validated the memories of those frightening days when the Germans had been on edge, explained why the town had been spared the brutal reprisals that had befallen other communities suspected of harboring partisans. Vera wanted to do something to acknowledge what had happened, to honor the unnamed soldier who had risked his life, partly to protect her town's civilians. She proposed to the local council that they erect a small memorial, nothing elaborate, just a simple plaque acknowledging that Soviet forces had operated in the area during December 1943, and that their actions had contributed to the town's eventual liberation. The council agreed, and in 1984 they unveiled a modest memorial in the town square. The plaque didn't mention Victor by name, didn't detail the specific events. It simply acknowledged that Soviet soldiers had fought in and around Krasny Bereg during the winter of 1943, contributing to the ultimate defeat of the German forces. It was generic enough to be uncontroversial, specific enough to mean something to those who knew the fuller story. Vera stood at the unveiling ceremony, thinking about the young girl she'd been, hiding in a cellar while history unfolded above her, and about the unknown soldier who had protected her town in ways she hadn't understood until decades later. But sometimes, on cold December mornings, when frost clung to the remaining old buildings, elderly residents would mention seeing a figure in the ruins, a man in a white camouflage suit moving through the debris. They knew it was just shadows and imagination, the mind playing tricks in the winter light, but they would tell the story anyway. About the ghost sniper who had protected their town from German retribution, who had killed enemies but saved civilians, who had made a choice that meant something even in the chaos of war. It wasn't true, of course. Victor had left that place decades ago, had lived and died far away in Siberia. But the story persisted because people needed it to persist, needed to believe that individual choices mattered, that one person's actions could make a difference, even in the vast machinery of war. Whether the story was accurate in its details or not was less important than what it represented. The idea that human agency existed even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, that people could still choose to do what they believed was right, even when orders and logic suggested otherwise. The story took on a life of its own over the years. Parents told it to children who grew up and told it to their own children. Each telling added or subtracted details, changed emphasis, reshaped the narrative to fit the needs of the moment. Sometimes the sniper was portrayed as a hero, almost superhuman in his abilities. Other times, the story emphasized the difficult choices he'd faced, the moral complexity of his situation. The version that elderly residents told visiting grandchildren focused on his protection of civilians, on the idea that not all soldiers were the same, that some carried within them a sense of responsibility that transcended their military orders. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, more war records were declassified and made available to researchers. A historian from Moscow, researching sniper operations on the Eastern Front, came across Victor's file among thousands of others. The file contained the after-action report from Krasny Bereg, the intelligence assessment of the mission's success, Victor's subsequent transfer to the training command, and a brief notation about his death in 1979. The historian included a brief mention of the operation in his book, a footnote really, one example among many of individual initiative and tactical skill during the war. The book found its way to Krasny Bereg, to the small library that Vera Nikolaevna had helped establish. She read it with intense interest, finally learning the name of the soldier who had protected her town. Viktor Petrov, from Siberia, a hunter who had become a sniper, who had survived the war and lived to old age. She wished she could have thanked him, could have told him what his actions had meant to the people of her town, but he was long gone, buried in Siberia, probably never knowing how the story of that December mission had lived on in the town where it happened. The mission had been called off too late. 21 enemy snipers were already dead. But in the end, Viktor Petrov had found a way to make that matter, to turn a potential disaster into something that saved lives rather than cost them. It wasn't the mission he'd been given, but it was the one he'd chosen to complete. And in the final accounting, in the small measure by which individual actions are judged, it was enough. His story became part of the larger tapestry of the war, one thread among millions, but a thread that connected military necessity with human compassion, that showed how even in the worst circumstances, people could find ways to protect the innocent while fulfilling their duties as soldiers. That balance, that difficult navigation between competing obligations, was perhaps the truest measure of his character, the real legacy he left behind.